guys, you're welcome to chapter 10, where we'll be looking at disease and immunity. So the syllabus content or syllabus objective for this lesson include should be able to define pathogens and transmissible diseases. I'll advise you actually pause and copy down your learning objective or read it through so you understand the content that we will cover for this lesson. So this is the continuation of our learning objective. So once we're able to cover all this, then we are done with this topic called disease and immunity. So first, pathogens and transmission. So patho simply means disease, while gene simply means producers. So pathogen, these are disease-causing organisms. It includes bacteria, viruses, and some fungi. These are disease-causing organisms. It includes bacteria, viruses, and some fungi. Then another major keyword you need to know is host. So organisms that are infected by the pathogen is referred to as the host, while vectors are animals that help in the transfer of pathogens from one host to another, such as flies and mosquitoes. Now, you need to know at least this definition here because it comes out a lot, and you should be able to define it according to how it is stated in your syllabus. Now, transmissible diseases. Transmissible disease is a disease in which the pathogens can be passed from one host to another. It's a disease in which the pathogen can be passed from one host to another. So common infectious diseases in humans include things like flu. Sexually transmitted disease can actually be passed on from one host to another. So method of transmission of disease. There are many different methods or different ways that pathogen can be transmitted. Now, one of those ways are direct contact. Direct contact, number one. Now, the pathogen is passed directly from one host to another by transfer of body fluids. Transfer from one host to another by transfer of body fluids such as blood and semen. And examples are HIV, gonorrhea, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C. These diseases are transferred directly from one host to another due to the transfer of body fluids such as blood and semen. Now, example of diseases transmitted through direct contact: HIV, syphilis, gonorrhea, hepatitis, hepatitis A, B, and hepatitis C. So number two, we have indirect contact. Indirect contact is when the pathogen leaves the host. Take note, it leaves the host and is carried in some way to another uninfected individual. Leave the host and is carried in some way by another it's carried in some way to another uninfected individual. And indirect contact can be done through transmission in water droplet. Transmission in water droplet. So look at A, transmission in water droplet. For example, cold and flu, measles, and chickenpox. When the host cough, laugh, talk, and sneeze, you can actually transmit the pathogen. B here, transmission in infected drinking water. This example are cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. We also have transmission by touching contaminated surface. Things like athletic foot, fungus, transmitted by walking on damp floor. It can also be transmitted in insect bite, such as mosquito bite in the case of malaria. So these are the ways in which disease can be transmitted: direct, indirect contact. Through direct contact, through the transfer of body fluids, while indirect contact have to do with transmission in water droplet, transmission in infected drinking water, transmission by touching contaminated surface, and transmitted in insect bite. So we have method of transmission here, direct and indirect method. So uh, direct method in blood, it can be transmitted through blood because it has to do with tissue fluid, e.g. from a scratch. Pathogen will not have access. And body fluid during sexual intercourse, you have in air, in food and drink, injected by blood, injected into your blood by animal vector, in this case mosquito. Then we have touching of contaminated surface can also transmit diseases. So let's look at defense. How does the body defend against pathogen? There are three main ways in which the body defends itself against diseases. There are three main ways in which the body defends itself against diseases. Now, one of those ways is mechanical barrier. These are structures that make it difficult for pathogen to get past them and into the body. An example are your skin, which cover almost all part of your body to prevent infection from pathogen. If it is cut or grazed, it immediately begins to heal itself, often by forming a scar. Then we have hairs in the nose, and these make it difficult for pathogen to get past them further up the nose, so they are not inhaled into the lungs. Then we now have two is chemical barriers. These are substances produced by the body cells that trap or kill pathogen before they can get further into the body and cause diseases. Now, example, the first one has to do with mucus. It is made in various places in the body. Pathogen get trapped in the mucus and can then be removed from the body by coughing, blowing the nose, and swallowing. Then we now have stomach acid. These are chemical barriers. Stomach acid the stomach contain hydrochloric acid, which is strong enough to kill any pathogen that have been caught in mucus in the airways and swallowed, or have been consumed in food or water. Then we have the third method of defense is cells. So different type of white blood cells work to prevent pathogen reaching areas of the body they can replicate in. First, we have the phagocytes, but that's by phagocytosis, which involve engulfing and digesting pathogenic cells. Engulfing phagocytes engulf pathogen and produce enzymes that digest them. And the second part of cells is the lymphocytes that have to do with producing antibodies. So these antibodies which clump pathogenic cells together so they can't move as easily, and this is known as agglutination. And releasing chemicals that signal to other cells that they must be destroyed. So look at method of defense. We have chemical method, and we also have mechanical method. Now in chemical method, it has to do with mucus that lines the tube of the respiratory system, contain enzymes, lysozymes that kill pathogen. We also have acid in the stomach, kill microorganisms in food and drinks. And the nose contain hair that trap microorganisms in air that is breathed in, then our skin is a thick barrier covering all the body to prevent pathogen from getting into it. So immunity, here we look at the concept of antigen and antibodies. Antigen and antibodies. Now all cells have proteins. Please, this part is quite very important. All cells have proteins and other substance protecting from their cell membrane. Now, these are known as antigens and are specific to that type of cell. Then we have lymphocytes have the ability to read the antigen on the surface of a cell and recognize any that are foreign. Now, they then make antibodies which are which have complementary shape to the antigen on the surface of the pathogenic cell. Now, the antibodies attach to the antigen and cause agglutination, that's clumping together. This means the pathogenic cells cannot move very easily. At the same time, chemicals are released that signal phagocytes that they are called present that need to be destroyed. That there are cells present that need to be destroyed. Now, example is, let's look at this diagram. Let me try and explain this whole content with it. You see, these are lymphocytes. So we have lymphocyte 1, lymphocyte 2, and lymphocyte 3. Now, on the surface, and this is a pathogen. So on the surface of pathogens, there are antigens. Now, these are antigens, and lymphocytes have the ability to recognize the antigen that is found on the surface of a cell. Now, these are antigens. This is the antigen here on the surface of a cell. Now, what the pathogen will do is, lymphocytes will, once they recognize it, they will now produce antibodies. So these are antibodies which are Y-shaped substance here. These are antibodies. Now, antibodies are supposed to have complementary shape to this antigen. So if you look at this 1, 2, 3 lymphocyte, you find that is this 2 lymphocyte number 2 that have complementary shape to the antigen here. So once they have complementary shape with the antigen, what it will do is it will release these lymphocytes. So lymphocyte 2, and these lymphocytes will now clip to this antigen. It will clump to the antigens that is found on the surface of the pathogen. Once that is done, like what you see here, this is what is now called agglutination. Antibodies cause agglutination by clumping onto pathogens. Now, once it clumps onto pathogen, it will now release chemicals that will signal phagocytes that there are cells that need to be destroyed. Then phagocytes will move towards the clump pathogen and engulf it into its system and release enzymes that will help to break it down and to become harmless. Now, reading this through, you find out that the initial response of a lymphocyte encountering a pathogen for the first time and making specific antibodies for its antigen. So the lymphocytes will make specific antibodies for its antigen, and it can take a few days, during which time an individual may get sick. However, lymphocytes that have made antibodies for a specific pathogen for the first time will then make what is known as memory cells. Once it does it for the first time, it will make memory cells that retain the instruction for making those specific antibodies for that type of pathogens. Now, this means that in the case of reinfection by the same type of pathogen, antibodies can very quickly be made in greater quantities, and the pathogen destroyed before they are able to multiply and cause illness. This is how people can become immune to certain diseases after only having them once. Now, it does not work with all disease-causing microorganisms, as some of them mutate. That means when they mutate fairly quickly, it means they change the antigen on their cell surface. So if the antigen change on their cell surface, that means that particular memory cells for um, antibodies will not work for the new microorganism that have mutated in terms of change the antigen. So the body system needs to produce another antibodies that will be able to clop to that pathogen. Now, therefore, if they invade the body for a second time, the memory cell made in the first infection will not recall them, as they now have slightly different antigen on their surfaces. And examples are common cold virus. It mutates easily. So there is something called, another thing we'll look at now is active and passive immunity. So active immunity has to do with making antibodies and developing memory cells for future response to infection is known as active immunity. Making antibodies and developing memory cells for future responses to infections is known as active immunity. Now, there are two ways in which this active immunity response happen. First, the body has become infected with a pathogen, and so lymphocytes go through the process of making antibodies specific to that pathogen. And once it does that, it will now make a memory cell. Another way in which active immunity can be formed is through vaccination. So active immunity, however, is slow acting, but it provides long-lasting immunity. Take note of this in case they ask you the difference between active and passive immunity. Active is slow acting and it provides long-lasting immunity. While in the case of passive immunity, this is when ready-made antibodies from another source are introduced to the body. This is when ready-made antibodies from another source are introduced to the body. So passive immunity is fast acting, it's short-term defense against pathogen by antibodies acquired from another individual. And examples are from mother to infant by breast milk, via the breast milk. Now, this is important as it helps the very young it helps the very young to fight off infection until they are older and stronger and their immune system is more responsive. So the antibodies that is found in the breast milk is used to fight against infection in the baby until the baby system is strong enough and the immune system can now defend itself and produce lymphocytes and phagocytes. While injected antibodies is another form of passive immunity for certain disease which the individual is already infected and a fast response is required, like rabies and tetanus. The body does not make its own antibodies or memory cells in passive immunity. In passive immunity, it cannot make antibodies on its own, neither can it form it can make any form of memory cells. So memory cells can only be found in active immunity, and active immunity is slow acting and it provides long-term immunity through the creation of memory cells. So let's look at disease caused by the immune system. There are certain diseases that are caused by the immune system itself, and that is majorly the type 1 diabetes. So occasionally the cells of the immune system start to attack the body own cells. Now, this is rare, as lymphocytes usually recognize their own body cells by the antigen. They recognize their own body cells by the antigens on the cell surface and do not respond to them. However, in this situation, specific body cells are targeted by lymphocytes and antibodies are made against them, thereby destroying them. One example of this type of disease is type 1 diabetes. The type 1 diabetes. Now, people who suffer from this disease no longer make their own insulin. Take note. People who suffer from this disease no longer make their own insulin and so are unable to regulate their blood glucose level. Now, this is because their immune system is targeting and destroying the pancreatic cells. The immune system is targeting and destroying the pancreatic cells, which are responsible for making the insulin, eventually leading to dangerously high glucose level in the blood. Now, you see, like here, we have insulin producing cells, but once the immune system produces antibodies that target these insulin producing cells, then you now have it here. Look at the insulin producing cells. They are all dead. So as a result, they could not produce insulin anymore that will help to convert excess glucose to glycogen. So that individual will now begin to suffer from a disease called type 1 diabetes. Now, what are the symptoms of type 1 diabetes? Some of the symptoms is blurred vision, breathlessness. They have nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, urinary infections such as glycosuria, where their urine have high amount of glucose. They also have suffer from weight loss and hyperventilation. So these, if it comes out, just remember to list out three. Highest. It won't be more than 4 or 5 symptoms of diabetes. So we'll now look at vaccination in the next